An epiphany. In the afternoon, as the waters began to rise, Pia noticed that she was seeing less and less of the dolphins. This was confirmed by a glance at her data sheet. It seemed the animals had begun to disperse with the turning of the tide. Through the early hours of the day, the pace of Pia's work had been dictated by the belief that this was a school of migrating dolphins that might depart at any minute. But now she began to wonder. These animals hadn't given the impression of being headed anywhere in particular. On the contrary, she had got the feeling that they had gathered here to wait out the ebbing tide until the water rose again. But that made no sense either. She told herself it just didn't fit with what she knew about these animals. Orcella were of two kinds. One tribe liked the salt waters of the coast while the other preferred rivers and fresh water. The difference between these communities was not anatomical, it had only to do with their choice of habitat. Of the two populations, the coastal was by far the more numerous. The waters of southern Asia and northern Australia were reliably believed to contain several thousand of them. Freshwater Orcella, on the other hand, were a rare and dwindling breed. Only a few hundred now remained in Asia's waters. Coastal Orcella were not known to linger for hours in one place and were more likely to range freely along the shore. Their freshwater cousins were more territorial and not nearly so gregarious. In times of heavy rainfall, when the rivers rose, they would roam far afield, chasing their prey into more tributaries and even into flooded rice fields. But in the dry periods, when the rivers began to drop, they would make their way back to certain spots. These were usually deep water pools created by quirks of geology in the riverbed or by the water's patterns of flow. In Cambodia, Pia had tracked populations of Orcella in several pools along the Mekong, from Phnom Penh to the Laos border. She had found the same individuals returning to the same pools year after year. But when the seasons changed, these dolphins traveled hundreds of kilometers downriver. In one unfortunate instance, an animal had swum all the way down from the Laos border only to drown in a gill net near Phnom Penh. Pia had come to the Sundarbans believing that any Orcella she found there would be of the coastal variety. This seemed only logical considering how salty the waters were in this region, but what she had seen today made her wonder if she hadn't made a mistake. If these were coastal Orcella, what were they doing congregating in a pool? That was out of character for them. Only their river-dwelling kin did that. But those could not be river dolphins either. The water was too salty. And anyway, riverine or Orcella didn't leave their pools in the middle of the day. They spent a whole season in them. So what kind of animal was this? And what did this odd behavior mean? As she mulled over these questions, a thought came into Pia's mind. Was it possible that these Sundarbans Orcella did twice each day what their Mekong cousins did once every year? Had they found a novel way of adapting their behavior to this tidal ecology? Could it be that they had compressed the annual season rhythms of their Mekong relatives so as to fit them into the daily cycle of tides? Pia knew that if she could establish any of this, she would have a hypothesis of stunning elegance and economy. A thing of beauty was rarely found in the messy domain of mammalian behavior. What was more, the idea might well have profound implications for the conservative of this endangered species. Protective measures would be much more effective if they could be focused on particular pools and specific movement corridors. But the hypothesis begged as many questions as it answered. What, for instance, were the physiological mechanisms that attuned the animals to the flow of the tides? Obviously, it could not be their circadian rhythms since the timing of the tides changed from day to day. What happened in the monsoon when the flow of fresh water increased and the balance of salinity changed? Was the daily cycle of migration inscribed upon the plimpest of a longer seasonal rhythm? Pierre remembered a study that had shown there were more species of fish in the Sundarbans than could be found in the whole continent of Europe. The proliferation of aquatic life aquatic life was thought to be the result of the unusually varied composition of the water itself. The waters of river and sea did not intermingle evenly in this part of the delta. Rather, they interpenetrated each other, creating hundreds of different ecological niches, with streams of fresh water running along the floors of some channels, creating variations of salinity and turbidity. These microenvironments were like balloons suspended in the water, and they had their own patterns of flow. They changed position constantly, sometimes floating into midstream and then wafting back towards the shore, at times being carried well out to sea and at others retreating deep inland. Each balloon was a floating biodome filled with the endemic fauna and flora, and as they made their way through the waters, strings of predators followed trailing in their wake. This proliferation of environments was responsible for creating and sustaining a dazzling variety of aquatic life forms, from gargantuan crocodiles to microscopic fish. Now, as she sat in the boat thinking about these connections and interrelations, Pia had to close her eyes, so dazzling was the universe of possibilities that opened in her mind. There was so much to do, so many queries to answer, so many leads to follow. She would have to acquire a working knowledge of a whole range of subjects: hydraulic, sedimentation, geology, water chemistry, climatology. She would have to do seasonal census of the Orcella population. She would have to map the dolphins' movements corridors. She would have to scrounge for grants, apply for permits and permissions. There was no horizon to the work that lay ahead. She had been sent to the Sundarbans for a fortnight to do a small survey on a shoestring budget. But to follow through on the questions now buzzing in her head would take not a week or two, but years, even decades. She had perhaps 15 to 20 years of active field research ahead of her. She sensed that this project would consume all those years and more. It was the work of a lifetime. Pia had often envied those field biologists who had found monumental subjects to work on. Jane Goodall in the mountains of Kenya, Helene Marsh in the swamps of Queensland. Being unambitious by nature, she had never imagined that something similar might come her way one day. And yet here it was, and she had stumbled on it by chance, exactly when things seemed to be going wrong. She recalled the mythologies of discovery that had attracted her to the sciences as a child, and how the most miraculous seemed always to be those that had the most quotidian origins. Archimedes and his bathtub, Newton and his apple. Not that her work would be in any way comparable or similar, but now at least she could see what it was about, how it happened that an idea floated unexpectedly into your mind, and you knew in an instant that this was an errand that would detain you for the rest of your life. She had never had high aspirations for herself as a scientist, although she liked cetaceans and felt an affinity for them. She knew it was not just for the animals that she did what she did. As with many of her peers, she had been drawn to field biology as much for the life it offered as for the intellectual content, because it allowed her to be on her own, to have no fixed address, to be far from the familiar while still being part of a loyal but loose-knit community. This would not change any of that. For the most part, it would be the usual grind of writing applications, trying to find funding, and so on. Whatever came of it in the end, it was a certainty that it was not going to create an upheaval in science. But at the same time, who would have thought that it would be so intensely satisfying to have your own future resolved, to know that what you were going to be doing next year and the year after that until who knew when. And yes, it was true that whatever came of it would not revolutionize the sciences or even a minor branch of them. But it was also true that if she were able to go through with it, even a part of it, it would be as fine a piece of descriptive science as any. It would be enough as an alibi for life. It would do. She would not need to apologize for how she had spent time on this earth.